On August 28, 2003, a pizza delivery man walked into a bank with a bomb locked around his neck. 28 minutes later, he was gone, torn apart in a parking lot while cameras rolled and the world watched. This is a true story. But here's what keeps me awake. The bomb wasn't the mystery. The mystery was whether the man wearing it was a victim or a volunteer, whether he walked into that tower clearing knowing what waited for him, or whether he believed, right up until those final beeping seconds, that someone was going to save him. His name was Brian Wells, and what happened to him that afternoon in Erie, Pennsylvania, would become one of the most disturbing cases the FBI has ever classified. A crime so theatrical it looked like fiction, so brutal it could only be real, and so tangled in lies and contradictions that even a federal conviction couldn't answer the one question that matters most: who was using whom? I'm Julian Cross, and tonight we open FBI major case number 203, the collar bomb case, the one they called Pizza Bomber, the one where the scavenger hunt was never meant to be solved. Welcome back to the Midnight File. Erie, Pennsylvania, sits on the shore of Lake Erie like a town that time forgot to finish. Industrial, working class, quietly fraying at the edges. The kind of place where everyone knows someone who knows someone, where secrets travel through bar stools and back porches, and where loyalty and suspicion live in the same house. In the summer of 2003, most people in Erie had never heard of Brian Douglas Wells. He was 46 years old, unmarried, living quietly in a small house, making a modest living delivering pizzas for Mamma Mia's pizzeria. Those who knew him described him as gentle, childlike even. A man who seemed content with simplicity, a shift at the pizza shop, a few beers after work, maybe some time with a woman he saw now and then. He wasn't ambitious. He wasn't dangerous. He was, by every account, unremarkable. But on that hot Thursday in August, Brian Wells became the center of something so strange, so calculated and so cruel that it would haunt investigators for years. Because what happened to him wasn't just a crime, it was a performance, a puzzle wrapped in a tragedy wrapped in a lie. It started, as so many strange things do, with a phone call. At around 1:30 in the afternoon, Mamma Mia's pizzeria received an order for 2 small pizzas. The delivery address was unusual, the base of a television transmission tower on Peach Street, a dirt road off the main route surrounded by woods, not a house, not a business, just a tower. The kind of place you'd only go if you were lost or looking for something. The order was placed by someone using the name Thomas, a detail that would later dissolve into the fog of conflicting testimony and convenient amnesia. But the pizzas were made, and Brian Wells was sent. He left the shop sometime after 1:30, driving his old Geo Metro, the pizzas sitting in their warming bag on the passenger seat. He knew the roads. He'd driven them 100 times, but this delivery would be different. This delivery would be the last thing he ever did as a free man. What happened at that tower is something we have to piece together from fragments, witness statements that shift depending on who's talking, physical evidence that raises more questions than it answers, and the cold, methodical findings of federal agents who spent years trying to understand how a pizza delivery became a death sentence. But here's what we know for certain. When Brian Wells arrived at that tower, he was met by people he knew, not strangers, not masked kidnappers, people from his own life, from the small, tangled network of relationships that defined his world in Erie, and those people locked a bomb around his neck. The device was heavy, roughly 10 pounds of metal, wires, and explosive material, fastened with a combination lock that would require specific keys to remove. It sat just below his collarbone, a collar of cold steel pressing against his skin, impossible to ignore, impossible to remove. The bomb was real. The timer was real, and the instructions he was given were as elaborate as they were cruel. He was handed a cane, a wooden walking stick that concealed a loaded shotgun inside, a weapon disguised as a prop, one more surreal detail in a plan that seemed designed as much to confuse as to succeed. He was given a canvas bag, and he was given a note, handwritten in block letters, outlining exactly what he had to do next. The note read like something out of a thriller, a scavenger hunt with lethal stakes. It directed him to rob the PNC Bank branch on Peach Street, demanding $250 in cash. After the robbery, he was to follow a series of additional instructions, traveling to various locations around Erie to retrieve keys and combinations that would supposedly allow him to disarm the bomb. The language was precise, clinical, and chilling. It referred to we and us, making it clear that this was not the work of a single mind. And it made one thing brutally clear: if he deviated from the plan, if he contacted police, if he failed to meet the time limits, the device would detonate. Brian Wells got back in his car. He drove toward the bank, and whatever he was thinking in those moments, whether he believed the bomb was real, whether he thought he could actually complete the scavenger hunt, whether he was terrified or resigned or clinging to some desperate hope, those thoughts went with him. At 2:20 p.m., Brian Wells walked into the PNC Bank. He was wearing a baggy shirt, the kind of oversized clothing that might hide the bulk of the device beneath. Witnesses inside the bank later described him as oddly calm, not frantic, not visibly panicked. He approached the counter, handed over the demand note, and waited. The teller, reading the note with growing alarm, began gathering cash. Wells didn't make threats. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, a man going through motions that someone else had scripted for him. The entire robbery took only a few minutes. Wells left with approximately $8,700, a fraction of the demanded $250 stuffed into the canvas bag. As he walked out of the bank, he pulled a lollipop from his pocket and placed it in his mouth, a bizarre, almost childlike gesture that would later be dissected by investigators and online theorists alike. Was it nervousness, a signal, a memento of normalcy in a moment that had left normal behind? He climbed back into his Geo Metro and drove away. But he didn't get far. Police had already been alerted. Multiple patrol cars converged on the area, and within minutes, Brian Wells was pulled over in the parking lot of a nearby Eyeglass World. Officers approached cautiously, ordering him out of the vehicle, and what they saw stopped them cold. Beneath his shirt, clearly visible now, was the collar bomb. Wells was ordered to the ground. He complied, lowering himself onto the hot asphalt, his hands cuffed behind his back, and then he began to talk, desperately, frantically. He told officers that he'd been delivering pizzas when he was ambushed. He said a group of black men had forced the device onto him, that they'd made him rob the bank, that he didn't want to do it, that he had no choice. He begged them to help him. He begged them to get it off, but the officers kept their distance. Protocol in situations involving explosives is clear. Secure the perimeter, wait for the bomb squad, don't approach the device. So they waited. And Brian Wells lay on that pavement, the summer sun beating down, the minutes ticking away, the weight of the collar pressing against his throat. Bystanders gathered. News crews arrived. Cameras began to roll. The scene had become a spectacle, a real-time crisis unfolding in a strip mall parking lot in broad daylight. And then, roughly 25 minutes after he was stopped, the device began to beep. Wells heard it. The officers heard it. Everyone within earshot heard it. A series of rapid electronic tones, the sound of a timer reaching its end. Wells's pleas became screams. He twisted against the handcuffs, his body convulsing in panic, his voice breaking as he shouted that it was going to go off, that someone had to help him, that he didn't want to pass away. The officers backed further away. The bomb squad was still en route, still minutes out, racing through traffic, but not fast enough, never fast enough. And then the device detonated. The explosion tore through Brian Wells's chest, ripping apart tissue and bone, the force of it so sudden and so absolute that he was gone before anyone could reach him. The sound echoed across the parking lot, a sharp, violent crack that silenced the crowd and sent officers diving for cover. When the smoke cleared, Brian Wells lay motionless on the ground, the collar still locked around what remained of his neck, his blood pooling on the asphalt beneath him. He had been alive 30 minutes earlier delivering pizzas. Now he was evidence. If this story has already gotten under your skin, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, because the deeper we go into this case, the stranger it gets. And if you think you figured out what happened, I promise you haven't. The aftermath of Brian Wells's passing was chaos. Federal agents, local police, forensic teams, they descended on Erie like a small army, trying to make sense of a crime that seemed to defy every category they had. Was it a robbery, a conspiracy, A hostage situation gone wrong. The device itself was sophisticated, carefully constructed, the work of someone with mechanical knowledge and access to materials. The scavenger hunt instructions were elaborate, multi-layered, paranoid in their attention to detail. And the fact that Wells had died in such a public, theatrical way, captured on video, broadcast on news channels, suggested this was never just about money. This was about control, about spectacle, about proving that someone, somewhere could orchestrate something this twisted and get away with it. The FBI opened major case number 203. It would take them years to close it. In Wells's car, agents found the full set of instructions, 9 handwritten pages, each one outlining a specific step in the scavenger hunt. The language was cold, methodical, and deeply unsettling. It detailed exact locations, specific time windows, and consequences for failure. It referred to the conspirators as we, reinforcing that this was a coordinated effort. And crucially, forensic analysis would later reveal that the tasks outlined in those notes were essentially impossible. The time windows were too tight. The locations were too far apart. Several of the keys Wells was supposed to retrieve didn't actually exist, or led to dead ends, or were planted in places he'd never reach in time. In other words, the scavenger hunt was a lie, a delay mechanism, a way to keep Wells moving, keep him visible, keep him on a timer that was always going to run out. He was never meant to survive. But if Wells wasn't meant to survive, then why use him at all? Why not just rob the bank themselves? Why the collar? Why the show? Those questions would lead investigators to a small, deeply dysfunctional circle of people in Erie, people whose lives were so tangled, so marked by violence and manipulation, that the collar bomb plot starts to look almost inevitable. Let's start with Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong. Marjorie was 54 years old in 2003, a woman of sharp intelligence and severe mental illness, a combination that had shaped her entire life. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, among other conditions, and her history was a catalogue of chaos, multiple marriages, violent outbursts, restraining orders, and at least one prior incident that ended in a man's passing. In 1984, she had shot and ended the life of her then-boyfriend, claiming self-defense, and had been acquitted. Friends and acquaintances described her as brilliant but unstable, charming but cruel, someone who could manipulate the people around her with surgical precision. And in the summer of 2003, Marjorie needed money. Badly. According to later testimony, Marjorie had become obsessed with the idea that her elderly father was going to cut her out of his will. She wanted him gone, and she wanted to hire someone to do it, which meant she needed cash, a lot of it and fast. The collar bomb plot, prosecutors would later argue, was her solution. Rob a bank, use the proceeds to pay for a hit, eliminate the obstacle standing between her and her inheritance. But Marjorie didn't work alone, she couldn't. A plan this complex required help, and that's where William Rothstein came in. Bill Rothstein was 59, a former substitute shop teacher and handyman who lived in a modest house on the outskirts of Erie. He was intelligent, gifted even, with a deep knowledge of mechanics, electronics, and engineering. People who knew him described him as odd, eccentric, someone who enjoyed puzzles and took pride in his ability to build things. He had a workshop filled with tools, supplies, and half-finished projects, and he had a relationship with Marjorie that went back years, an on-and-off friendship marked by mutual manipulation and a shared taste for control. Rothstein was, many investigators believe, the architect of the device itself. The bomb was too well made, too carefully designed to be the work of an amateur. It required knowledge of circuitry, timing mechanisms, and explosive materials. It required someone who could think through logistics, someone who could build something that looked theatrical but was undeniably lethal. Rothstein fit that profile perfectly, but there were others involved too. Kenneth Barnes, a local drug dealer and longtime associate of Marjorie's, would later admit to being part of the conspiracy. Barnes was not an intellectual. He was not a planner. But he was useful, a man willing to do physical work, to intimidate, to coerce. And according to his own testimony, he was there at the tower when the bomb was placed on Brian Wells. He described Wells panicking, trying to back out, and Barnes himself physically restraining him, holding him down while others locked the collar in place. And then there was Floyd Stockton, a friend of Rothstein's who lived nearby, and others whose names would surface and vanish throughout the investigation, people who might have known, might have helped, might have stayed silent because they were scared or complicit or both. But at the center of this tangled web of relationships was one more body, one more victim who never made it to the bank. His name was James Roden. James Roden was Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong's boyfriend in the summer of 2003, a man described as gentle, kind, and deeply unlucky in love. He lived with Marjorie, endured her outbursts, and knew too much. According to prosecutors, Roden became aware of the collar bomb plot. He heard things, he saw things, he asked questions. And Marjorie, paranoid and ruthless, decided he was a liability. On a day in late July or early August, the exact date remains disputed, Marjorie shot James Roden in his own home. She then called Bill Rothstein, the man she could always count on to clean up her messes, and Rothstein drove over, helped her move the body, and stored it in a freezer in his garage. The body would remain there, frozen and hidden for weeks. On August 28th, the same day Brian Wells walked into that bank, Rothstein made an anonymous call to the police, directing them to his home and telling them there was a body in his freezer. When officers arrived, they found exactly what he'd described: James Roden's remains, carefully wrapped, preserved in ice. Rothstein claimed he'd only just discovered the body, that Marjorie had brought it to his house without his knowledge, that he was an innocent bystander trying to do the right thing. But investigators didn't believe him. The timeline was too convenient. The connections were too obvious. Roden had been ended because he knew about the bomb plot, and his remains had been revealed on the same day as the collar bomb robbery, perhaps as a distraction, perhaps as a message, perhaps because Rothstein himself was starting to panic. James Roden was the prequel to Brian Wells, the first casualty of a plan that consumed everyone it touched. If you're still with me, leave a comment below. Tell me what you think happened, because this case has more theories than facts and I want to hear yours. So let's talk about Brian Wells, because that's the question that haunts this entire case. What did he know and when did he know it? The FBI's official conclusion, laid out in the 2007 federal indictment, was blunt. Brian Wells was a co-conspirator, not a victim, not an innocent man forced into a nightmare, a participant, someone who had agreed, at least initially, to be part of the robbery plan. And there is evidence to support that. Not much, but enough to complicate the narrative. Brian Wells was not a hermit. He had friends, or at least people he spent time with. One of those people was Kenneth Barnes, the drug dealer who would later testify against Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong. Wells and Barnes knew each other through a woman named Jessica Hoopsick, a sex worker who had connections to both men. Hoopsick would later claim, years after the crime in interviews for the Netflix documentary Evil Genius, that she had introduced Wells to the conspirators, that he'd been told the robbery was going to be a staged event, a fake bomb, easy money for a couple hours' work. According to Hoopsick, Wells believed he was participating in a con, not a life-or-death scenario. He thought the device would be a prop, something convincing enough to scare the bank tellers, but harmless. He thought he'd walk into the bank, walk out with cash, and split the proceeds with the others. He had no idea, Hoopsick claimed, that the bomb was real. Other witnesses reported similar things. People who knew Wells said he'd mentioned wanting to make extra money, that he'd talked vaguely about a plan, that he seemed nervous but not terrified in the days leading up to August 28th. And the way he behaved during the robbery itself, calm, methodical, even stopping to eat a lollipop, doesn't suggest a man who believed he was about to be blown apart. But here's the problem. Brian Wells lied to the police. When he was stopped in that parking lot, when officers asked him what happened, he told them a story that was demonstrably false. He said he'd been ambushed by strangers, that unknown men had forced the bomb onto him, that he had no idea who they were or why they'd targeted him. That story fell apart almost immediately. The people who put the collar on him were not strangers. They were people he knew, people he'd spent time with, people he might even have trusted. So why lie? If he was truly an innocent victim, why not tell the truth? Why not name names, give descriptions, beg for help in a way that would actually help the investigation? One possibility is that he was still following the script. That part of the plan, part of the instructions he'd been given, was to tell the police a false story, to buy time, to create confusion, to protect the conspirators. If that's true, then Wells was complicit, at least to the point of the robbery. He knew he was breaking the law. He knew he was lying. He just didn't know he was going to end up gone. Another possibility is that he was terrified. That in those final minutes, lying on the pavement with a bomb around his neck, his brain went into survival mode, and he said whatever he thought might save him. That the lie wasn't strategic, it was instinctive. The desperate, irrational hope that if he could just convince the officers he was innocent, they'd risk getting closer, they'd try harder, they'd find a way to remove the device before time ran out. But there's a third possibility, one that's darker and harder to accept, that Brian Wells knew the people who put the bomb on him, but he didn't know they were going to make it real. That he showed up at that tower thinking this was all going to be theater, fake bomb, fake robbery, real money at the end, and only realized, somewhere between the bank and the parking lot, that he'd been set up, that the bomb was live, that the timer was real, that the people he trusted had just signed his death warrant. In that scenario, Wells lied to the police not because he was protecting the conspirators, but because he was still in shock, still processing, still clinging to the delusion that if he just followed the rules, played the game, someone would step in and stop this before it went too far. But no one stepped in, no one stopped it. And Brian Wells was torn apart in a parking lot while the people who put him there watched from a distance, safe and silent. The federal indictment lists Brian Wells as a co-conspirator, but even the FBI admitted publicly and in court that Wells was not fully informed, that he'd been lied to, that he'd been used. They described him as involved but not in control, a man who'd agreed to something and then found himself trapped in something far worse. Which makes him what exactly? A criminal who got what he deserved, a victim of people more ruthless than he could imagine. Both. That question is why this case refuses to let go, because the law demands clean categories, guilty or innocent, perpetrator or victim, and Brian Wells doesn't fit either one. He exists in the space between them, and that space is where cases like this live forever. Let's talk about the investigation. Because this wasn't a case that got solved quickly. It wasn't a case where someone confessed, the pieces fell into place, and justice was served. This was a slow, grinding, years-long process of following threads, chasing leads, and trying to force a group of deeply dysfunctional people to tell the truth. The FBI's focus, from the beginning, was on the device itself. The collar bomb was too sophisticated to be a one-person job, and forensic analysis of the materials used, the metal, the wiring, the explosive compound, pointed to someone with access to specific tools and knowledge. Bill Rothstein's name came up early. His mechanical skills, his proximity to the crime, his relationship with Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong, it all pointed in his direction. But Rothstein was careful. He cooperated with police when they came to collect James Roden's body. He gave interviews, played the concerned citizen, acted shocked and saddened by the whole affair. And then in 2004, he passed away from cancer. He never faced charges. He never admitted to anything. But in his final weeks, he gave a series of interviews to investigators. And in those interviews, he hinted at things. He described Marjorie as manipulative, dangerous, obsessed with control. He suggested, without quite saying it outright, that she was the mastermind and he was just a man who got pulled into her orbit. Was he telling the truth, or was he taking the opportunity in his final days to shift blame away from himself and onto someone who couldn't defend herself because she was behind bars? We'll never know. Rothstein took his secrets with him, but Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong was still alive, and she was not staying quiet. In the years following the robbery, Marjorie was in and out of court, in and out of jail, facing charges related to James Roden's passing. And while she was locked up, she talked. She talked to cellmates, to guards, to anyone who would listen. She bragged, she hinted, she dropped names and details, sometimes contradicting herself, sometimes doubling down. And those conversations, recorded and reported, became key pieces of evidence in the federal case. One of her cellmates, a woman who later testified at trial, claimed that Marjorie had openly discussed the collar bomb plot, describing it as her idea, her plan, something she was proud of. Another inmate reported that Marjorie had said Brian Wells deserved what he got because he'd tried to back out at the last minute. But jailhouse testimony is notoriously unreliable. Inmates have incentives to lie, reduced sentences, better treatment, the satisfaction of being useful to the state. And Marjorie herself was a deeply unreliable narrator, someone whose mental illness and narcissism made it impossible to separate truth from performance. Still, the pieces were coming together. Kenneth Barnes, the drug dealer, was arrested and agreed to cooperate. He admitted to being part of the conspiracy, described the scene at the tower, confirmed that Marjorie and Rothstein were the primary planners. In exchange for his testimony, he received a reduced sentence, 20 years, later shortened further. He would eventually walk free. In 2007, a federal grand jury handed down indictments. Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong was charged with armed bank robbery, conspiracy, and use of a destructive device in the commission of a crime. Kenneth Barnes was charged alongside her, and Bill Rothstein and Brian Wells were named as co-conspirators, both posthumously. Marjorie's trial began in 2010. It was a media spectacle, a courtroom drama filled with bizarre testimony, outbursts from the defendant, and a parade of witnesses describing a world of drugs, manipulation, and casual violence. The jury heard about James Roden, about the tower, about the scavenger hunt, about Marjorie's history of violence and her obsession with control. And after weeks of testimony, they convicted her, on every count. Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. She appealed, filed motions, challenged the reliability of witnesses, argued that she'd been framed. Every appeal was denied, and in 2017 she passed away in federal prison, still insisting she was innocent. But even with a conviction, even with a life sentence, the case didn't feel closed, because too many questions remained unanswered. Too many people who might have been involved were never charged. Too many details: who wrote the notes, who built the device, who made the final decision to kill Brian Wells, were never definitively proven. And that's the thing about this case. It's solved, legally. The FBI closed major case Jabber 203. The courts handed down a verdict, but solved and understood are not the same thing. If you've made it this far, do me a favor, share this episode with someone who loves true crime. Because stories like this don't just disappear, they echo. And the more people talking about them, the harder it is for the truth to stay buried. So let's talk about theories, because in the years since the collar bomb case, amateur investigators, online communities, and documentaries like Evil Genius have turned Erie, Pennsylvania into a true crime pilgrimage site. People have visited the locations, interviewed witnesses, dug through records, and built their own narratives about what really happened. Some believe the FBI got it right, that Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong was the architect, Bill Rothstein was the engineer, Kenneth Barnes was the muscle, and Brian Wells was a willing participant who got in over his head. In this version, Wells knew about the robbery, agreed to be the one who walked into the bank, and only realized too late that the bomb was real. He's not innocent, but he's not a villain. He's just a man who made a catastrophic miscalculation. Others believe Wells was set up from the start, that the conspirators never intended to let him walk away, that he was chosen specifically because he was gullible, desperate, and unlikely to be believed if he talked. In this version, Wells was told the bomb was fake, was promised easy money, and was betrayed the moment he showed up at that tower. He's a victim, pure and simple, and the FBI naming him as a co-conspirator is just the government covering for their failure to save him. A third theory focuses on Bill Rothstein as the true mastermind. Some investigators believe Marjorie was too chaotic, too impulsive to plan something this elaborate. They argue that Rothstein was the one pulling the strings, that he manipulated Marjorie, Barnes, and Wells, and that the entire plot was his attempt at creating the perfect crime, a puzzle so complex, so layered, that even if it failed, no one would ever fully understand it. In this version, Rothstein's final interviews, where he shifted blame to Marjorie, were his last act of misdirection. He went to his grave laughing at the FBI. And then there's the theory that more people were involved, that the conspiracy extended beyond the 4 or 5 names we know, that there were accomplices who stayed silent, witnesses who lied, people who helped with logistics or planning and were never identified. In Erie, a small town where everyone knows everyone, secrets don't stay buried forever. But they can stay buried long enough. The truth is probably some combination of all of these. Marjorie was brilliant and dangerous. Rothstein was skilled and manipulative. Barnes was willing and violent. And Brian Wells was somewhere in the middle, aware of some things, ignorant of others, used by people who saw him as expendable. But here's what we know for certain. The device was designed to eliminate. The scavenger hunt was designed to fail. And the people who put Brian Wells in that parking lot knew exactly what was going to happen. They just didn't care. There's a piece of footage from that day that's hard to forget. It's grainy, shot from a distance, but it's clear enough. You can see Brian Wells on the ground. You can see the officers standing back, their postures tense, their hands hovering near their weapons. You can hear Wells shouting, his voice muffled by distance but unmistakable in its desperation. And then you can see the moment the device detonates, a flash of light, a puff of smoke, and then nothing. Just silence. Just stillness. That footage was broadcast on news channels. It was uploaded to the internet. It's been analyzed, dissected, slowed down, replayed thousands of times by people trying to understand what happened. And every time you watch it, you're forced to confront the same uncomfortable fact. This was a real person, a real moment, a real ending. Brian Wells was not a character in a movie. He was a man who got up that morning, went to work, and ended the day gone in the most public, most humiliating, most preventable way imaginable. And the people who did this to him, Marjorie, Rothstein, Barnes, whoever else was involved, they turned his passing into a spectacle. They made him part of their story. They robbed him not just of his life, but of his dignity, his agency, his right to be anything other than a cautionary tale. That's what makes this case so disturbing. Not the mechanics of the bomb, not the complexity of the scavenger hunt, but the cruelty. The casual, calculated cruelty of people who saw another human being as nothing more than a tool, a prop, something to be used and discarded. And here's the question I keep coming back to. Why? Why go to all this trouble? Why not just rob the bank themselves? Why involve Brian Wells at all? The answer, I think, is control. This was never really about money. The $250 demand was absurd. No bank keeps that kind of cash on hand, especially not in a small branch in Erie. The conspirators had to know that Wells would never get the full amount. They had to know the bomb would go off before he finished the scavenger hunt. So the real point wasn't the robbery. It was the plan, the puzzle, the performance. It was proving, to themselves or to the world, that they could conceive of something this twisted and pull it off. It was about power, about showing that they were smarter, more ruthless, more willing to cross lines that normal people wouldn't even approach. Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong spent her entire life manipulating the people around her. She married men, used them, discarded them. She committed acts of violence and got away with it. She believed genuinely that she was smarter than everyone else, and in many ways she was. But intelligence without empathy, without conscience, becomes something monstrous, and the collar bomb plot was her masterpiece. Her magnum opus, the thing she'd spend the rest of her life bragging about, even as it destroyed her. Bill Rothstein was quieter, more calculating. He didn't need to brag, he just needed to build, to tinker, to solve the puzzle for its own sake. For him, the bomb wasn't a weapon. It was a challenge, a question. Can I make this work? Can I design something that looks like chaos but is actually perfect order? And when the answer turned out to be yes, when the device functioned exactly as intended, I think he felt satisfied, proud even. Never mind the man who ended up wearing it. Kenneth Barnes was the muscle, the enforcer, the one willing to hold Brian Wells down and lock the collar in place. He didn't design the plan. He didn't understand the bigger picture. He was just there to do the dirty work. And afterward, when the FBI came calling, he was smart enough to trade information for leniency. He served his time, he walked free. And as far as we know, he never lost a night's sleep over what he did. And Brian Wells? Brian Wells was the audience, the unwitting participant in someone else's nightmare. A man who thought he was playing a game and realized too late that the game was rigged from the start. Here's what I think happened. I think Brian Wells knew some of the people involved in the plot. I think he was approached, probably by Kenneth Barnes or someone connected to Barnes, and told there was an opportunity to make money. Easy money, a staged robbery, a fake bomb, in and out in an hour. I think he was shown the device, maybe even allowed to hold it, to see how convincing it looked, and was assured it was harmless. A prop. Movie magic. I think Wells agreed. Not because he was a hardened criminal, not because he wanted to hurt anyone, but because he was broke, bored, and gullible. He trusted people he shouldn't have trusted. He believed things he should have questioned. And when the day came when he drove out to that tower, he thought he was walking into a con, not a death sentence. I think the moment the collar locked around his neck, he realized something was wrong. The weight of it, the cold metal, the way the conspirators stepped back, the way they handed him the instructions and told him to move, now go, don't stop. I think he panicked. I think he tried to back out. And I think Kenneth Barnes, or someone like him, made it very clear that backing out was no longer an option. So Wells drove to the bank. He went through the motions, he followed the script. And the whole time, some part of him was hoping, praying, that this was still part of the act. That someone would step in, remove the device, tell him it was over, hand him his cut and send him home. But when he walked out of that bank with $8, $700 instead of $250, $0, when he saw the police cars converging, when he was forced to the ground in that parking lot and the officers wouldn't come near him, that's when it became real. That's when he understood. He'd been set up, used, sacrificed, and the people who did it to him were probably miles away by then, watching the news coverage, waiting to see if their plan worked. It did. I think Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong wanted the money, yes, but more than that, she wanted the control. She wanted to prove she could make a man do anything, even walk into a bank with a bomb around his neck. She wanted to watch the news and know that somewhere, someone was trying to figure out her puzzle. She wanted to be the smartest person in the room, even if the room was a prison cell. I think Bill Rothstein wanted to build something that would outlive him. A crime so strange, so technically perfect, that people would still be talking about it decades later. And he succeeded. We're still talking about it. We're still trying to understand it. His device worked. His puzzle held. And he passed away before anyone could prove he was the one who built it. I think Kenneth Barnes just wanted to survive, to make a deal, to tell the prosecutors what they wanted to hear, to get out with as little damage as possible. He wasn't loyal. He wasn't brave. He was practical. And in the end, practicality saved him. And I think Brian Wells just wanted to make it through the day, to deliver his pizzas, to collect his pay, to go home and have a beer and forget that anything unusual had happened. But he didn't get that. He got a bomb, a script, a parking lot, and 28 minutes of pure, unfiltered terror before the world ended in a flash of fire and noise. There's one more detail I need to tell you about. One more piece of the story that makes this whole thing even more unsettling. The scavenger hunt instructions, the ones Brian Wells was supposed to follow after the robbery, included specific locations around Erie. These weren't random. They were places that had meaning to the conspirators. One location was near Bill Rothstein's house. Another was near a site connected to Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong. The route they designed forced Wells to drive through parts of town where the conspirators could watch, where they could track his progress, where they had control. But here's the thing. Even if Wells had somehow completed the robbery perfectly, even if he'd gotten the full $250, even if he'd followed every instruction to the letter, the scavenger hunt would have failed. The time windows were mathematically impossible. The distance between locations was too great. The keys he was supposed to retrieve didn't all exist. Some of the combination codes were wrong. Some of the drop sites were empty. The puzzle was never meant to be solved. It was meant to keep him moving, to keep him visible, to ensure that when the timer ran out, he would still be in public, still surrounded by witnesses, still on camera. The conspirators wanted an audience. They wanted the world to watch, and they got it. Brian Wells passed away on television. His final moments were broadcast live. The footage was replayed, analyzed, dissected. It became part of the permanent record, part of the cultural memory of true crime. And that, I think, was exactly what Marjorie and Rothstein wanted. Not just a successful crime, but a legendary one. A crime that would be remembered, studied, turned into documentaries and podcasts and late-night YouTube videos. They wanted immortality, and they got it. At the cost of 2 lives, James Roden, who was ended because he knew too much, and Brian Wells, who was ended because he didn't know enough. In 2018, Netflix released Evil Genius, a 4-part documentary series that re-examined the collar bomb case. It featured new interviews with people who'd been close to the conspirators, including Jessica Hoopsick, the sex worker who claimed she'd introduced Brian Wells to the group. Hoopsick's testimony added a new layer to the story, or maybe just a new layer of confusion. She insisted Wells was a victim, that he'd been lied to, that he had no idea the bomb was real. She painted him as gullible, naive, a man who thought he was playing a role in a staged event and ended up caught in something far more deadly. But Hoopsick's credibility was questionable. She had her own legal troubles, her own reasons to reshape the narrative, and her account conflicted with other testimony, with the physical evidence, with the FBI's findings. So we're left, once again, in that frustrating space where the truth feels close but remains just out of reach. Evil Genius did something else too. It turned Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong into a character. The documentary featured recordings of her voice, clips from old interviews, footage of her in court. And what comes across again and again is her intelligence, her charisma, the way she could spin a story, shift blame, make herself sound reasonable even when describing something utterly horrific. She was magnetic, terrifying, fascinating. And I think that's dangerous, because the more we turn people like Marjorie into characters, the more we risk losing sight of the real victims. James Roden, who was shot and stuffed in a freezer. Brian Wells, who was blown apart in a parking lot. These were real people, real losses. And the spectacle, the puzzle, the documentary, the true crime industry that's grown up around cases like this, sometimes feels like it's playing into exactly what the conspirators wanted. Attention, infamy, a place in history. So let me be clear, Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong was not a genius. She was not a mastermind. She was a deeply damaged woman whose intelligence was twisted by mental illness and cruelty into something monstrous. Bill Rothstein was not a brilliant architect. He was a man with skills he used to harm others, to serve his own ego, to prove he was smarter than the people trying to stop him. Kenneth Barnes was not a reluctant participant. He was a willing accomplice who held a man down while a bomb was locked around his neck and then traded testimony for freedom. These are not people to admire. They're not anti-heroes. They're not even interesting once you strip away the spectacle. They're just small, petty, cruel individuals who hurt people for no good reason. And Brian Wells? Brian Wells was a man who made a mistake, maybe a big one. Maybe he knew more than we'll ever prove. But he didn't deserve what happened to him. No one does. Here's what stays with me about this case. It's not the mechanics of the bomb, though those are chilling. It's not the scavenger hunt, though that's deeply disturbing. It's not even the courtroom drama or the legal wrangling or the years-long investigation. It's the loneliness of Brian Wells in those final minutes. The way he lay on that pavement, handcuffed, the device around his neck, the officers keeping their distance, the bystanders watching from behind barriers. He was surrounded by people and he was utterly alone. He begged for help. He pleaded. He screamed. And no one could save him. That isolation, that knowledge that you're about to cease to exist, that the people around you are powerless or unwilling to stop it, that you're trapped in a nightmare with no exit, that's the real horror of this case. Not the complexity, not the conspiracy, just the raw human terror of a man who knew he was going to perish and couldn't stop it. I think about that a lot. I think about what must have been going through his mind in those final seconds. Was he angry, resigned, still clinging to hope? Did he understand, in the end, what had been done to him? Or was it all just noise and fear and the desperate animal instinct to survive? We'll never know. Brian Wells took those thoughts with him, but we can remember him, not as a co-conspirator, not as a victim, just as a person, a man with a job and a life and people who knew him, a man who deserved better than what he got. The collar bomb case is closed, legally. The FBI filed their reports. The courts issued their verdicts. Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong passed away in prison. Bill Rothstein passed away before he could be charged. Kenneth Barnes served his time and walked free, and Brian Wells is buried in a cemetery in Erie, his gravestone simple and unremarkable, the kind of marker that gets overlooked unless you're specifically looking for it. But the questions remain. Who wrote those notes? Who decided Brian Wells would be the one to wear the bomb? Who made the final call to let the timer run out, knowing he would perish? And why, after all the planning, all the effort, all the cruelty, did they only get 8 to 700? Maybe the answer is that the money was never the point. The point was the plan, the puzzle, the game. The conspirators weren't trying to get rich. They were trying to prove they could do something no one else had done. They were trying to create a crime so strange, so layered, so theatrical that it would be remembered forever. And they succeeded. This case will be studied for years, decades maybe. It will be turned into more documentaries, more podcasts, more think pieces and Reddit threads and late-night conversations. It will live on exactly as the conspirators intended. But so will the memory of Brian Wells, lying on that pavement, begging for help, and gone before anyone could reach him. If you're still here, if you've stayed with me through this entire story, then you know what this channel is about. It's about the cases that don't let go, the ones that sit in the back of your mind and refuse to leave, the ones that make you question what people are capable of, what the justice system can and can't solve, and what it means to be a victim in a world that's so eager to assign blame. So if this story haunted you the way it haunts me, leave a comment. Tell me what you think happened. Tell me whether you believe Brian Wells was guilty or innocent or somewhere in between. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because the next file might be even darker. The next case might be even stranger. And I'll be here every week opening the files that the world tried to close. Every town keeps a secret. Every case has a loose thread. And every story, no matter how strange, comes down to the same basic truth. People are capable of terrible things. The collar bomb case is a reminder of that. A brutal, public, unforgettable reminder. It's a story about intelligence twisted into cruelty, about trust turned into betrayal, about a man who walked into a nightmare he didn't understand and never walked out. It's a story about how easy it is to use people, to see them as tools, as props, as expendable pieces in a larger game. And it's a story about how hard it is, even with all the resources of the federal government, even with years of investigation and testimony and forensic analysis, to fully understand what happened when people decide to hurt each other. Brian Wells died on August 28, 2003, but the questions surrounding his passing are still alive, still unresolved, still waiting for someone to find the final piece of the puzzle. Maybe that piece doesn't exist. Maybe the truth is exactly what the FBI said it was, a conspiracy led by Diehl-Armstrong and Bill Rothstein, with Brian Wells as a knowing but ultimately expendable participant. Maybe there are no more secrets to uncover, no more revelations waiting in some forgotten document or overlooked testimony, or maybe there's something else, something the conspirators took to their graves, something that would change the way we understand this case entirely. I don't know, and that uncertainty, that inability to ever fully close the book on a story this strange, is what keeps me coming back to it. Because in the end, the collar bomb case isn't just about what happened on August 28, 2003. It's about what happens when intelligence and cruelty collide, when desperation meets opportunity, when people who should have been strangers found each other in a small town and decided to do something unforgivable. It's about the fragility of trust, the weight of consequences, and the way a single afternoon can echo through decades, refusing to be forgotten, demanding to be examined, insisting that we look at it and remember that every crime, no matter how theatrical, comes down to real people making real choices that destroy real lives. Brian Wells delivered pizzas. He lived quietly. He hurt no one. And he ended up at the center of one of the most disturbing cases in FBI history, his final moments captured on camera, his name forever linked to a crime he may or may not have fully understood. That's the tragedy, not the bomb, not the conspiracy, just the simple, terrible fact that a man went to work one day and never came home. And somewhere in Erie, Pennsylvania, people still remember. They still talk about it. They still drive past that parking lot, that bank, that transmission tower. They still wonder what really happened, who was really responsible, and whether Brian Wells, poor, Unlucky Brian Wells was a victim or a volunteer. The truth, I suspect, is both, and neither, and something more complicated than either word can capture. But that's the thing about the Midnight Files. They don't offer clean answers. They offer questions, complications, contradictions. They offer the truth as it really exists, messy, incomplete, and impossible to fully resolve. So I'll leave you with this. If you were in that parking lot, if you were one of the officers who stood there watching Brian Wells beg for help, what would you have done? Would you have risked approaching the device? Would you have tried to remove it, knowing it could detonate at any second? Or would you have done exactly what those officers did, kept your distance, called for backup, and hoped the bomb squad would arrive in time? It's easy to judge from a distance. It's easy to say what we would have done, how we would have acted, what choices we would have made. But in that moment, with a real bomb and a real man and a real timer counting down, I don't know that any of us would have done differently. And that's the final horror of the collar bomb case. Not that it happened, but that when it did, there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The file is closed, the case is solved. But the questions remain, and so do I. Until next time, this is Julian Cross. Welcome to the Midnight File.